Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Anthropocene, the era in geological history in which human interference in the planetary systems is on such a scale that we recognize it as being something distinctive to previous geological eras. And that brings with it, of course, a whole new series of responsibilities for humankind, which is one of the main things which we're going to explore during this week. And in fact the 2 days that follow next week. My name is Jim Hall. I'm Director of the Environmental Change Institute here in Oxford, and within the Environmental Change Institute, we have, over the last couple of years, run this series, Welcome to the Anthropocene, which goes alongside the intensive week for our new cohort of students on the Master's Programme in Environmental Change and Management. So our Master's students, who I'm pleased to say, I think are all here, have had a series of intensive lectures during the day, and then we close each day this week with a public lecture. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the first of these. And before we close, I'll do a brief introduction to what follows on the following days this week. But before that, it's a great pleasure to welcome Camilla Toulmin, who has encouraged me not to give a long-winded biography. She was, up until very recently, Director of the International Institute for Environment and Development, and has a very distinguished history of scholarship and publication and research in Africa, particularly around drylands-related issues, which is what you're going to talk to us about this evening. Camilla.
Thank you very much, Jim. And it's really nice. I see I've been promoted to professor. So thank you for that. So I'm going to talk about what happens to land and property rights in the Anthropocene, winners and losers. And the subtitle is From Open Frontier to Settled Landscape. As Jim said, I think you'll be hearing a lot about the Anthropocene over the next few weeks, and there's a whole range of different dates and periods over which it can be said to span. It's usually defined as that epoch, as Jim says, during which humanity's imprint becomes the dominant influence on the functions of the planet's climate and environment. Some argue it should start with the establishment of settled agriculture 10, 12,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. For others, it's the late 18th century and the Industrial Revolution with its harnessing of water, coal, and then other fossil fuels as power. Some see it as 1945 and the explosion of nuclear bombs as the sort of iconic moment. Or maybe it should be 1972 and the Meadows and Meadows book, The Limits to Growth report, that was very much a moment in time when people began to take real stock of human-environment interactions. If instead we take it from 1945, you'll see that over that period, particularly 1945-1950, we've really witnessed a massive growth in people and production and consumption, what some people call the Great Acceleration. And these graphs give you some sense of this huge takeoff in production and consumption. Trends in energy are a good proxy for what's happened more generally. There are a few iconic figures that I thought I'd test you with, who've been able to help us comprehend this extraordinary shift in our thinking. Can anyone do the one top left? Just shout out. No? Rachel Carson, well done. One on the right, top. Barbara Ward, founder of IIED. Bottom left. Swedish. Arrhenius. Middle one. Very good. So it was Ken Boulding who said the only people who believe that you can have infinite growth on a finite planet or economists. Well done. On the left, Malthus. Yeah. What about these ones? A little bit closer to home. Top left. Esther Boserup. Really interesting Danish writer. Top right? Very good. Top, bottom left? Yep. And Kate Rowas. And Kate will be bringing her donut, I think, to come and see you either this week or pretty soon. Good. Well, you've done quite well on that. So each of them, I think, have helped us think about the people-environment interactions, where the real boundaries are, whether they can be stretched and how, and at what cost, and how to combine this understanding of the environmental boundaries with how we're going to make sure that everyone on the planet can prosper and have access to meeting their basic needs. If we think of the Anthropocene, particularly as it relates to land, the closing of the land frontier has happened at different moments and in different places. Going back to Mesopotamia, the land there was very limited that could be farmed and depended hugely on close management of water. Hammurabi, who's the guy sitting down on the left, was the 6th king of Babylon and drew up a code 3,750 years ago, the Hammurabi Code, which regulated a whole number of different things, including property, theft, slander, and a range of other legal things, and provided the basis for lawyers to control our lives for the rest of all time. In North America, settlers from Europe established farmsteads and ranches across the Great Plains, which had been, of course, the homelands of many indigenous groups, and gradually you saw the closing of this frontier, with native peoples forced further and further back, and finally into reservations over the course of the 17th and 19th centuries. So there's a frontier that started to close. And then in the 16th to 18th century, the enclosure movement in England also shifted patterns of land ownership and use from that feudal structure of infield, outfield, and common lands to the field patterns much closer to what we recognise today. So it went from this sort of mosaic on the left to a much more structured pattern on the right. And of course, in Scotland, the enclosures and clearances in the 18th and 19th century set up the big farms of East Lothian and Aberdeenshire along the east coast, and the large grazing estates on the west coast, having rid those lands of the clanspeople in favour of farming the Cheviot sheep. And so started the boats shipping people out from Scotland and over to North America, Australia, New Zealand, and beyond. So losers in all these cases were those people who had small holdings, those people who had secondary rights, cotters, those who relied on the commons to make a living. I've seen the closing of the land frontier in the small West African village in Mali, where I spent 2 years doing my fieldwork back in 1980. The villagers then said, you can walk forever in that direction, the bush will never finish. I beta fo hi Congo tesigama. 5 years ago, when I was back there, what they said was, Congo Bana, the bush is finished. And this is a result of the growth both in the number of people in that and neighbouring villages, plus an inflow of people from elsewhere, plus herders seeking land to settle and farm more permanently, which means that land that used to be open bush is now more or less occupied. So when people come searching land to farm in this village, the elders say, sorry, but you need to go further west. So go west, young man, they say. But of course, in a few places, the pressure on land is lifting and the frontier is opening up. In the Pyrenees, for example, land is less and less in demand, with the human population numbers now less than 10% of what they were in the mid-19th century. Areas that were farmed and grazed 100 years ago are now re-wooded, and wild boar, deer, and bears roam where smallholders, herders, and charcoal makers used to make a living. If you talk to old people, they talk about the invasion of their landscape by trees and the exodus associated with that of people, activities, schools, shops, and infrastructure that's accompanied this shift in land pressure. Possibly 2007-8 can be seen as the moment when land and the Anthropocene came clearly up against each other, at least so far as the press was concerned. The food price crisis suddenly made people very, very worried about food security and led to a search for land across the world by companies and governments from which to source basic commodities. Globalization of land as an asset is also evident in its growing role as a component within investment portfolios. And while much land has been under pressure from global commodity markets for decades, if you think about rainforest in Brazil, for soy and beef cattle, equally Indonesia and Cambodia's land for oil palm and rubber, it was particularly in Africa that was seen, if you like, as the last frontier, that this globalization of demand for ordinary farmland has been evident, with big worries about very large slices of land being offered for sale at knockdown prices. You'll have seen, no doubt, this diagram from Johan Rockstrom et al., which highlights the scarcity of many planetary resources, as well as limits to the planet's capacity to absorb wastes, such as greenhouse gases and nitrate pollution. In fact, you could say that some planetary resources, such as coal, oil, and gas, are not nearly scarce enough relative to our ability to absorb their wastes. Economics 101 tells us that in a situation of scarcity, as supply contracts relative to demand, the price of the scarce resource goes up. In a city such as London, as demand for property goes up, especially from foreign buyers keen to acquire a stake in a safe haven, and supply changes very little, then scarcity starts to bite and the price goes up. I watch this quite closely because my children are trying to get established as young people in London, and the price of property is horrendous. Makes it very difficult, so much so that my daughter has decided to go and live in Glasgow, where the costs of living are about a third of that of London. It's interesting to see that big difference. So as London prices go up, then people look further and further afield, to Cambridge, to southeast England, even to Oxford. In the UK, farmland prices have also been rising fast. If you wanted to make money, you should have bought land 5 years ago, because your money would have doubled in the last 5 years. And that's very little to do with yields of wheat or barley, but much more to do with a variety of other demands being made of land. such as recreation, amenity values, golf courses, urban development, photovoltaic, sun farms, and so on. Well, who are the losers? Well, people without the money to get into the property market, reliant on rents that are trending sharply upwards, and also the public authorities in charge of our cities who are failing to capture for the public purse this extraordinary windfall through having a proper rating system. I don't know if you know, but rates on property have not been amended since 1992, I think. And that therefore means that, you know, in cities like London, where you've seen this astonishing shift in property prices, the public authorities have gained little or nothing from that. So if you look at the Anthropocene and planetary resources, this also helps us focus on what happens to the global commons as demand rises relative to supply. Now, the global commons are those resources which, because of their nature and scale, make it almost impossible for us to divide them up and allocate separate chunks to individuals or smaller entities. And this absence of clearly identified property rights creates a wide range of what are called externalities, often also called market failures. There are many iconic examples, such as ocean fisheries, grazing lands, water bodies, and of course, the global atmosphere. The management of common property resources has been a topic of great interest and innovation, thanks to the work of eminent writers and theorists such as Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom and her group, who combined both conceptual analysis with a lot of really interesting casework from around the world. And for people who don't know Ostrom's work, I really urge you to spend a bit of time reading it. It's written with a clarity of prose and an interest both in the detail, but then rising up to think about what that means in terms of broader concepts, which is really remarkable. Garrett Hardin's work on the tragedy of the commons also prompted considerable work and thinking, if only to find good arguments to refute his somewhat simplistic assessment of inevitable failure and tragedy. There are multiple ways in which common property resources can be managed, depending on the resource in question, the user group and range of interests involved, the strength of institutions by which people can organise themselves, and how easy it is to monitor use of that resource. And there are big issues around how you tackle free riders who game the system. In the case of our common atmosphere, lots of tools are being tried, such as pricing the pollutant by imposing a carbon tax, issuing permits, such as through the European Emissions Trading Scheme, allowing people to sue for compensation. A group in the Netherlands has taken its government to court on the grounds that they're not doing enough to cut greenhouse gas emissions with all of the concomitant damage on future generations. There are social institutions that can be used to try and regulate behaviour, as when we call for divestment from investment in fossil fuels and try to heap opprobrium on those who take no notice. And I know that Alan Rusbridger will be talking a bit about the Keep It in the Ground campaign when he comes to talk later this week. And of course, government can also do things like invest in the Apollo programme to try and bring down the cost of renewable energy to a point where it makes no sense to burn fossil fuels anymore. And all of the above are probably needed if we're going to make progress. But I think there's some also fairly fundamental questions to ask and answer as well. So on what basis do you try and establish property rights to the global commons? Well, let's take the global atmosphere. These are assets for which no formal rights have existed to date, a bit like the bush around my old village, Dolongabugu, in Mali. The global atmosphere until recently has been considered an infinite open frontier into which every individual, company and nation could tip its emissions without constraint. But 30 or more years ago, we started to recognize that it's definitely not infinite, and hence agreement is needed between all potential rights holders to decide what is the effective size of the atmosphere's capacity to absorb greenhouse gases, and how should that limited capacity be divided up. How many gigatons can we emit safely if we are to limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade? How much space would there be if we sought to limit warming to 4 degrees centigrade, and so on? And those obviously are questions that are being answered thanks to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So denial of the science in the IPCC is a means for current large polluters to continue their erosion of this common property by claiming that the frontier is still open, or the resource is, say, twice as big as the science tells us. And the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change Convention is the place where decisions are made about how we should divide up that common resource. Should it be by dividing it up by the number of people in each nation? How should we take account of historic responsibility? There are lots of different views, and obviously people adopt views that usually align with where their particular interest lies. The highly unequal power held by some means their voices count much more than others. We've worked particularly with the least developed countries group that can usually only send 1 or sometimes 2 people to these negotiations, in contrast to the teams from the US, EU countries, Saudi Arabia that field 150, 200 people. It's a completely unequal struggle, really, to try and get your voice and interest heard. But whatever happens, and whatever the basis for allocating rights to emit, we must rapidly agree how collectively to bridge this big emissions gap between current trajectories and the pathways to a 2-degree world. Remembering that 2 degrees also brings significant and damaging impacts, especially for more vulnerable parts of the world. The current summing of commitments made prior to the next COP to be opened in Paris at the end of next month indicates a likely 2.7 degree centigrade as the outcome of all of the measures being done effectively. So more clearly needs to be done. Some people say the best way forward would be to say, okay, let's go for 0 emissions. It'd be much easier to identify the route and monitor it. But rights, of course, don't exist in a vacuum. They need monitoring and enforcement if they are to bite. And the ability to police and enforce property rights depends on the credibility and resources of the institution given this task. Hence the attempt by skeptics to cast doubt on the reputation of key figures in the IPCC at both a personal and a professional level. I mean, who remembers the leaks of the emails just before Copenhagen COP15, which was very much a calculated attempt to try and cast doubt on the credibility of certain IPCC scientists. There are big problems, of course, around monitoring and verification of greenhouse gas emissions. You're talking about an invisible gas. You're talking about billions of sources, each one of us, and huge costs of data collection for monitoring. It's much easier to use certain proxies, such as the companies responsible for digging up and selling fossil fuels, or the electricity generation, or other big users of energy. countries have also been arguing about who will do the monitoring and the merits of self-verification versus some kind of independent process. Verification has obviously taken a bit of a dent recently, as we've seen with the ease with which VW has been able to gull the regulators. The other big commons, of course, are the oceans. And for marine resources, there are different rights associated with different parts of the sea. The territorial waters that are 12 nautical miles from land, the exclusive economic zone that stretches a maximum of 200 miles from shore, and the high seas beyond this, which are under international jurisdiction. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was negotiated and agreed in 1982, coming into force in 1994, and this lays out the rights and responsibilities of different parties to the convention. But even where a country has got a right to that 200 miles of fishing grounds, it can be very difficult in practice to enforce that effectively. And there's been particular problems on the west coast of Africa, where a whole number of trawlers from different parts of the world have been trawling away many of the fish that local communities rely on, and there's very limited capacity to police that coast effectively. But I know you'll be looking more at the commons, especially climate and atmosphere, over the course of the week, so I'll now move on to land. Mark Twain famously said, "Buy land, they're not making it anymore." And of course, while at the large scale that's true, it's not strictly true, as this map of the Netherlands will show you, where over the course of several centuries, they've added 17% of their surface area through land reclaimed from the sea and from lakes. Dubai equally has been building land in the Gulf. Hong Kong International Airport is also built on a completely man-made island. Singapore has added 20% to its land area, and so on. So there are some examples of where land can be made, but it's pretty expensive. Even in Burkina Faso, they've been taking land that was heavily degraded and investing a lot in bringing it back to life. But it takes a lot of effort if you're going to be able to make it truly productive again. As I showed earlier, UK land prices have doubled in 5 years, and that's been not due to a doubling of intrinsic yields from agriculture, but the combination of its scarcity as an asset and anticipated growth in value and a whole range of non-agricultural uses. But the UK is by no means an exception. And if you look at the price of land in a whole number of countries, you will see over this period from 2002 to 2012, very considerable increases in the capital value of land. Looks as though Romania is the one that's done best, but you've got Mozambique in there, Zambia. In fact, Britain is kind of only about halfway in terms of the average. Areas that were formerly not seen to be attractive have now being eyed up by investors. The market in land has become increasingly global, with a wide range of interests and brokers engaged in the market. If you go onto the web, you can find lots of opportunities to invest your money in global agricultural land funds. And there's this meeting due in London, Global Ag Investing, in November. So go along and find out more about what you can get for your money. So they're looking at land in Sri Lanka, New Zealand, Uruguay, Mozambique, a whole number of places. And there are quite a number of governments that are both investing in land elsewhere and also putting their territory up for sale. For example, the price spike of 2007-8 gave Saudi Arabia a real scare. They had been growing quite a lot of their grain in these enormously intensive agricultural schemes on their own territory, but with water tables falling very, very fast, finding it very difficult to buy food in the global market in that price spike period. They've now negotiated land across the Red Sea in Sudan. Ethiopia has also been seeking investors interested in acquiring land for agricultural investment, especially in the outlying regions down from the highlands in the lowlands of the country. And many other African governments have been following a similar track. Indeed, I've just been invited to a conference in a couple of weeks' time where the African Development Bank announces that 65% of the available extra land for farming and crop development can be found in Africa. So investors are warmly welcomed to come and make that land productive. So you will have seen, I'm sure, a lot of reference to this general global, what some people call a global land grab, which has been driven by both rising commodity prices, insecure access to food markets, policies to promote biofuels, and a growing globalization of investment and assets. There's been some uncertainty about the scale of the land acquisitions, with some fairly scary numbers being bandied around at the height of the crisis. Estimates by some NGOs suggested that something like 250 million hectares of land were being acquired in this way, which is an area the size of Western Europe. And these were investment deals mainly in poor parts of the world. Companies seemed to be targeting countries where land governance systems were particularly weak, and there was a justifiable fear that large amounts of land were being seized with no accountability or global pressure to stem the tide. For example, one South Korean company had apparently negotiated more than 2 million hectares in Madagascar. That's half the arable land. A US businessman claimed to have had something like 500,000 hectares in South Sudan. Robin, you'll probably know the figures better than me. The Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi, managed to negotiate 100,000 hectares in Mali. And an Indian businessman, tens of thousands of hectares in lowland Ethiopia to grow roses. That's the Mar-Libya project in Mali. My colleagues at IID, led by Lorenzo Cocciula, have done very careful work to try and assess the data that shows that the scale is a lot less than that 250 million hectares, and that the pressure for large-scale acquisitions has dimmed somewhat over the last 7 or 8 years. Our estimates put things closer to something around about 30 million hectares that have been the subject of firmly identified transactions. However, it's actually quite difficult to know what the figures are, largely because a lot of these transactions take place behind closed doors. Very little of the detail of these negotiations has any kind of oversight from civil society or even from Parliament, so that it's actually quite difficult to know what the figures are. But this is what we have found so far. But of course, that's not to say there's not a problem, because even smaller amounts of land displace significant numbers of people, and very often that land is the best quality land. It's the land with access to water, it's the land close to infrastructure, you know, with best market access, and so on. Such large land acquisitions have been made much easier by the fact that in many countries under written law, the government actually owns the land. The government is the formal land rights holder, holding land in trust for its citizens. Unwritten customary rights are recognised only for so long as the land's not needed by a more powerful interest. And in the event of land being taken for the public good, in compensation, farmers usually get the value of the crop in the ground and some kind of payment for the loss of their house. In many African countries, 80 to 90% of the land has no formal documentation of these customary rights. So most smallholders and herding peoples are highly vulnerable to losing their land. The process of land registration is also very slow and costly and has mainly focused on land in urban and peri-urban areas, plus land on irrigation schemes. So there's an urgent need to find ways to speed those registration processes up, make it easier and cheaper to register rights. In addition, common lands are often accorded no protection at all. They're seen as wasteland with no productive use. If there's no visible sign of the hoe or the plough, then they're considered not to have been worked and therefore not subject to some form of right. Equally, governments often don't recognise the ability of collective groups to hold rights if they are not formed into some kind of formal administrative entity, such as a village or a district council. As a consequence, common lands like grazing, woodlands, water bodies and wetlands have been especially subject to seizure. So how much land is there in the world? I should have tried to get you to guess this. Well, apparently there are 13,003 million hectares. I was wondering about that 3, but that is what they say on the FAO website anyway. So of that, so that's the total land area in the world, if the Netherlands hasn't been adding little bits when no one was watching, of which cropland is 22%, grazing land is 32%, then you've got forest and a range of other uses. And it's particularly that grazing land which is vulnerable to being converted into farmland. And this gives you a sense of what farmland prices are in different places around the world. This comes from Savills. Savills are a estate management and property firm, and they produce a regular newsletter, which is really, really interesting actually, because it's written for people interested in investing in land. And so it says things like, you know, well, remarkable returns can be gained, but, you know, you need to be willing to understand some of the political risks involved. So at IID, we've been trying to identify who has actually been negotiating these large-scale land acquisitions. It's commonly believed that it's China, India, and the Gulf nations that are responsible. And you can certainly find some examples of this. But what we found is that much land has actually been acquired, firstly, by domestic elites, and secondly, that the majority of the foreign investors actually come from Europe and North America. And while there had been a view that a lot of this land was being acquired to grow grain, actually, a lot of the land that has been acquired is being used for non-cereal crops, such as oil palm, sugar, and forestry. Supporters of large-scale land acquisitions have argued the need to encourage these investors to bring their money and technology to invest in African farming in the hope that they'll generate jobs, food supplies, export earnings, and tax revenue. But so far, many such investments have delivered very little. Land holdings have been poorly developed. Often only a small fraction of the land allocated has actually been put under production, and employment generation has been minimal in comparison with the number of people that have been displaced. So local people suffer the damage of losing their land with few, if any, mitigating benefits. So it seems fairly easy to identify winners and losers. Winners include governments who've been selling off land for political patronage and personal benefit. So key people in government are some of the winners in the immediate term. However, the costs of such sell-offs can be considerable for government in terms of conflict and political dispute. And where land is being leased, often for 50 or up to 99 years, the options for government in future are also seriously curtailed. A few local chiefs may also be benefiting by acting as intermediaries. But if you look through the literature, there have been very few positive results for ordinary people. You can point maybe to a few thousand jobs in the flower trade in Ethiopia and Kenya, but for most local land users, they've lost from their expulsion from land on which they had relied for livelihoods and identity. They've become losers not only because they've got little economic and political power, but also because of a fundamental mismatch in institutions and systems for recognizing rights. Most countries have coexisting forms of law that some people call legal pluralism. The written statutory system normally wins, just like the Normans and the Doomsday Book won out over the Anglo-Saxons in the 11th century. Customary rights stem from things like being first settler, through inheritance from a family lineage, negotiating access, long occupation and use, and working of the land. But rights based on these principles are weak in the face of statute law, which is usually framed in a foreign language. It's inaccessible and incomprehensible to ordinary people. So looking forward, how are land rights likely to fare? Well, everything suggests that continued growth in production and consumption will drive further demand for land and the commodities it produces. And while there may be a slowdown currently as a result of slower growth in China, this is likely to pick up again soon. So finding ways to strengthen rights of the individual and collective rights remains very important, because rights once lost are very, very difficult to regain. So the best tactic is to try and protect them while you've got them. As land becomes scarcer, people will need to access it in different ways. So secondary rights also become more and more important. And I'm talking now of things like leasing, renting, sharecropping of land. These forms of land contract are hugely important in many places. 40% of the farmland in X is leased. Where do you think X is?
Can you say the percentage again?
40%.
UK?
US. So even in a place that you think of as, full of owner-occupiers, actually 40% of the land is being farmed under a variety of secondary rights, in which various forms of sharecropping, whereby the farmer and the investor share the risk, are very important. Equally, much of the success in coffee and cocoa production in countries like Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana has been through leasing of land between indigenous people and migrants from the Sahel. I'd like, before I finish, to look at one or two of the other aspects of the Anthropocene and how they impact on land and property rights, and in particular, the impact of climate change on land. Climate change renders some land more valuable. With global warming, Scandinavia can start to develop its champagne varieties, and you might hope to be able to find a good claret from Achtermachti. But other land becomes less valuable, especially that subject to big changes in rainfall and flood risks. In the extreme case, land goes underwater, as coastal parts of Bangladesh are likely to do. equally Kiribati and the Maldives. And once it goes underwater, it loses pretty much all of its value. London's been able to protect its very high value land through the Thames Barrier for now. But if you look at the number of times that the Thames Barrier has been required to lift to protect London from flooding, whereas it might have done it once or twice a year back when it was first built in the 70s and 80s, it's now being raised 20, 30 or more times every year. So the threat is substantially greater. And the question really is whether we need to enhance the Thames Barrier in the face of that increased threat. Climate change is likely to prompt increased migration from areas of stress to better favoured regions, which means that some people will need to acquire secondary rights to land. As I said, in West Africa, after the droughts of the 1970s and 80s, several millions of people came south from the Sahel, seeking land to farm in Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana and Togo. And that has generated some of the difficulties and political conflicts suffered by Côte d'Ivoire in the last 15 years. Credible prices for carbon will also increase the value of forested or forestable land that can be put under REDD payment schemes. But who can claim the right to this land and forest resource? I think there's lots of room for dispute here. And climate policy that commits us to greater use of biofuels also brings increased demand for land. So whether it's through encouraging mitigation through carbon sequestration in trees and soils or building resilience to climate change, both will need increased attention to ownership and management of land and natural resources. Building resilience will need greater investment in infrastructure and more careful management of soil and water. And that means that land users need firmer rights to build that resilience. I think we also need to think about how we build our cities, given the urbanization process underway. And here we've got the example of Atlanta in Georgia, the US, versus Barcelona, both of which have got the same population, but a hugely different physical imprint and a hugely different carbon footprint associated with that. Addressing climate change effectively should lead to a major shift in the value of fossil fuel assets, coal in particular, but also oil and gas. The value of your reserve, your property right in that reserve, will be affected by whether or not there's a market for these sources of energy in future. A global agreement on cutting greenhouse gas emissions would bring down their value very significantly, as it's reckoned that more than 70% of known reserves need to be kept in the ground. So nations and companies with big reserves, such as those here, face the prospects of stranded assets on a very major scale. And this is one of the main reasons why big oil companies and certain countries that depend very heavily on fossil fuels have been less than keen on success in the climate change negotiations. So, in conclusion, how will land and property rights fare in the Anthropocene? Well, so far, we've seen our ability to manage the global commons is hampered by the fact that we've got 193 governments with competing jurisdictions and tax regimes. The growth of global corporate power and financial markets makes it impossible for the public sector to control private interests effectively. So collective assets and public goods suffers at the expense of those interests. Rising demand for key commodities will put continued pressure on key resources. Complex investment chains mask relations, enable secrecy in financial flows and taxes, making it much harder for individual governments to levy the taxes due. This is just an example of one investment project. and the different movements of funds between different jurisdictions. Investment treaties being signed or being planned will also make it harder for governments to act to protect and recognise their citizens' interests. And there's a lot of worry about the TTIP. So the pressure on land and property rights is not going to go away. So what combination of local and global actions would help strengthen local people in their claims to land? Well, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that were signed in New York last month, do give much greater attention than the MDGs to questions of governance and inequality, as well as food security. Most countries of the world have also signed up to something called the Voluntary Guidelines for the Governance on Land and Natural Resources. There's also a pretty effective group of civil society organisations like the International Land Coalition, Oxfam, Global Witness, and others who work to flag more egregious examples of land grabs. And there's the annual World Bank Conference on land that brings together governments and professionals involved in land policy and administration to learn and share together. But to my mind, there's no substitute for effective local action which establishes respect from government and which provides checks and balances in the system. And there's no substitute for brave, often very brave people from the countries concerned standing up and fighting for justice. Technology can help in making it cheaper to survey and map land, and also, like the Liberian Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, this online registry of investment contracts can also help in terms of transparency. But ultimately, it's really a governance issue. You need to build expectations and expertise, and that means training in land administration, support to paralegal workers, and so on. And if our purpose is to achieve stronger rights for local people, then we need to understand processes and where you can intervene effectively. So that means asking questions like, how are investment contracts negotiated and agreed? And how can this be opened up to greater citizen scrutiny? So that's much of the work that we've been doing at IID, finding leverage points to try and demand greater accountability. So do visit www.iied.org and find out more. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Camilla. That's got us off.
Took a bit long.
Well, that's got us off very, very well in this week's series, both setting the scene and exposing some of the controversies and conflicts and dilemmas of the Anthropocene. We have time for some questions, which I'm sure those controversies and conflicts will raise. Yeah, at the back there.
Yeah, I have a quick question about regional legislation, and so going forward with the Anthropocene, how do you see, or do you see at all, the land rights of a nation changing based on whether what they do with their land has an impact on neighbouring countries?
Are you thinking about somewhere in particular?
Well, an example that I was thinking of is in Iraq, they're drying up the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers through various forms of agricultural schemes and desertification. And the result of that is that there are massive sandstorms blowing over into Iran and affecting the diversity of livelihoods of people there. And so just like how, as that I assume will become an increasing problem into the Anthropocene, how would legislation regionally deal with that?
Should I take several or shall I go?
Yes, let's pick up 2 or 3 questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Is in the work of IID, do you think the change in what property right means is like any viable course? For example, I don't know. Usually, property to land, like a right to land property, includes the right to alienate, pretty much hurt everything like in the land. You could burn it, you could pretty much not use it, you could fallow it, farm it in an unsustainable way. So would you think that restricting the way you use land but still not considering that a lease, is that any viable course of direction?
Okay, and one more? Yeah.
So coming to the UK from San Francisco, your words on how the high cost of living and how it pushes people out of cities really resonated with me because it's a big problem in that area too. So some have suggested that the wanting to make more sustainable cities more efficient because increasing urbanization could have some positive effects on the environment, having millions of people working together. But if it's too expensive for people to live in those cities and they start to move outwards, how do we counteract that trend and incentivize either governments to make it more affordable or keep people within the cities?
Okay,
Thank you.
3 questions.
Yeah.
Cities?
Well, if I start with the water basin question, because that's a very interesting one, and where there are a number of agreements that exist for the management of shared river basins, but which is not completely what you asked about. But if you look at things like the Nile Basin Agreement, or if you look at there's an agreement that ties West African countries along the River Niger, and also I think probably both the Tigris and the Euphrates have got some sort of agreement that links riverine countries along that river. There are ways in which you can try and handle those disputes and come to some sort of negotiation. But your question is more about how sand displaced by these schemes, not related to river basin countries, might be dealt with. I haven't heard of anything of that sort, but it's certainly true if you go back 2 or 3 decades to when Britain was accused, rightly, by the Scandinavian countries of giving them acid rain. The UK government was strongly urged to find ways to limit particularly sulphur emissions from different factories in order that that acid rain problem would be very much diluted. So it's the kind of thing that I imagine that, you know, countries, as long as they're on speaking terms, can try and resolve themselves. And there are arrangements for managing shared river basins, though they're not always enormously friendly, as I'm sure Jim and his colleagues know. Things like the Nile Basin Agreement is, for a long time, Egypt and the Sudan basically kind of controlled the agreement, and then Ethiopia had the temerity to try and build a dam on the Blue Nile and generated a tremendous hullabaloo because obviously both Egypt and Sudan felt their rights on the Nile waters were being infringed by this. And for a horrible moment, it looked as though Egypt was going to, send its bombers and physically try and damage the dam. I think that moment has now passed, and some agreement has been made in terms of the speed with which the dam will be filled, and therefore which should limit the amount of damage felt downstream. In terms of property rights and what you're allowed to do, well, I think anybody who owns property in the UK recognises that actually what they're allowed to do is quite severely constrained by various forms of government regulation, which means that if you want to do any building work or if you want to cut down a tree in your garden, actually you need to go through some form of acquisition of a permit to be allowed to do that. Even farmers in Kenya or in Mali are very often not allowed to cut down trees on their land because the rights to trees, even on farmland, have got some form of government jurisdiction associated with them. So I think property has always got a number of constraints around it that government seeks to establish in order to get people to manage it better. Excuse me. In terms of urbanisation, I mean, it's, I suppose, because of thinking about London in particular, which I think has become very much a global city. The question of how to make it still a livable city for people who don't have big money is something that has exercised a lot of people's minds. And I suppose, I think you have to try and, you know, tax property at the right sort of level. I think you also need to make provision for people who actually come from that country to get preferential access to cheaper property, or else find that many of the kind of services and mixed residence and use of that city fall away. I mean, we've been working quite a lot in Mumbai, where there are some famously big, famously big slums, and the chief minister of Mumbai was saying to a colleague of mine, well, we should just clear these people out, you know, they create too much mess, it's very unsightly. And so my colleague David said, well, all right, who drives your car? Well, I've got a chauffeur. Well, where does your chauffeur live? Well, lives in Dharavi, the slum. And who cooks your food? I've got a cook, of course. Well, where does your cook live? In Dharavi, the slum. You know, and so on and so on and so on. So bit by bit, it was quite an interesting conversation around how having a mosaic of different kinds of places to live, even for rich people at the top of the tree, it was important to recognise you needed to find places where poor people could live as well as rich.
Have a drink of water, and we'll have three more questions. Yeah.
My question is it's a legal question and about risk. So in the same way that if you receive stolen goods, you don't necessarily have title to them and they can be taken back. Do you think over time that some of the land could be clawed back, because it might be possible to prove that whoever sold it didn't actually have the rights to sell it? So especially a government, you know, who might own land for the nation, was not actually in a position to sell that which they didn't actually own. That might in future put more risk on the transaction, and in future people might be more careful about buying land in a different country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that with land grabs and countries coming in, using the land for shorter periods of time, that they exhaust the land and, you know, take it right down to so it's a degraded state, as opposed to people that would live there and see it as, you know, indefinite, so they might need to come back to it?
There's just one over here. Last question.
Can I make a statement before a question?
As long as
I did a lot of work on settler agriculture in southern Africa, and essentially where white settlers were relatively successful for certain periods of time, it came through a huge amount of social and political engineering. It didn't happen through a free market. And I think there are kind of, what's being peddled now is rather a dangerous kind of colonial thing. Camilla, when you and I worked on Diffid's Land Tenure Advisory Group focusing on Africa about 15 years ago, I guess we had some expectations that governments could do something useful. Craig over the conference last month asked this question: how best to respond to the great contempt shown by Africa's ruling elites towards their own small-scale farmers and pastoralists. I think this is a really serious thing. I find it really scary.
A legal question related to can you claw back land that has been wrongly sold? Well, it's certainly the case that there are hundreds of thousands of disputes in the Ghanaian courts relating to land purchases and sales of one sort or another. They are actually all largely between different Ghanaians who claim that so-and-so has sold them land, and then, you know, brothers and cousins and so on of the person who's made that sale then turn up and say, hang on a minute, you know, it wasn't yours to sell. And so I think there's very often problems associated with people thinking that there's a single owner, whereas normally there's a much wider kin group that feels that they've got some rights involved in a piece of land. So there is quite a lot of dispute around a whole set of land transactions already. In terms of some of the large-scale acquisitions, it may well be that some of the early negotiations have not got very far because the purchaser realised that the person selling the land hadn't really got the full rights to be able to sell. And if you read the Savills regular newsletter, one of their key cautions is the need to try and understand the background in terms of the being able to clarify exactly who the real rights holder is. So yes, indeed, I think there are lots of ways in which people could, with a bit of legal backing, contest some of these purchases. For example, if you look at the Libya contract, which is the 100,000 hectares of land that Colonel Gaddafi and his government negotiated shortly before his demise. Thank you. It's actually 2 sides of paper for 100,000 hectares of land. So I think a lot of people are saying, you know, it just is inconceivable that the government of Mali could really have sold 100,000 hectares of land and have it just on 2 sides of paper. So it's very unclear actually what the status of the Libya project is at the moment because of the demise of Colonel Gaddafi and the considerable turmoil in the Libyan state that's followed that. But and I need to get up to date with what people in Mali are doing about trying to contest that land sale. But in the interim, what's happened is that a lot of people have kind of crept back onto the land from which they were displaced, given that there's no very obvious authority around seeking to push them on. What evidence is there for large-scale acquisition, exhausting the soil and moving on? Well, from what we can see, there's very little in the way of ability by government to exercise any kind of enforcement function in terms of how the land is used and what kind of environmental impacts that land use generates. I've not found a huge amount of evidence on that sort of short-term exhaustion risk as yet. What we have found, though, is that a lot of people are acquiring land and then kind of just sitting on it, so it's like a land bank. So actually they're not using the land, but what they are doing is banking that land as an asset for potential future use. Where you do see this problem of short-termism is particularly in the mining sector, where very often you see a very rapid turnover of ownership in mining companies. I'm thinking particularly of Ghana now, where you can see almost every year a lot of these concessions being sold on to another company and then to another. And I think what's going on there is a very short-term process of trying to reap maximum benefit and not be left holding the responsibility for clearing up that land when the mine is exhausted.
One example might be clearance of rainforest in Brazil for cattle farming, and then after a while, there wasn't deep soil there anyway in the first place, and so the land is seriously less productive.
As a consequence, yeah. And I guess some of the big oil palm plantations as well. But oil palm, that can go on for, 30 plus years, so that's not exactly short term. But I suppose as land becomes recognisably more scarce, a lot of these companies are being forced to think about how they can continue to reinvest in that land rather than know that they can just kind of leave it behind and move on to another patch. Robin, your question. I mean, I think it's quite difficult to know what organisations or people like you and IIID can rightly do. And so my strategy has always been to identify and work with people in these different countries who themselves feel outraged by the way in which their elite are behaving. So people in government sometimes, people in the research sector, legal professionals, people in the media, people in business who feel that it's really important to establish a different kind of relationship between government and citizens. And although it's a longer-term project, I think it's really the only project that provides that solid base on which to go forward. The problem is how many people will have lost their land and suffered in the interim.
We must draw the discussion to a close, I'm afraid. But thanks very much once again for sharing your insights and experience with us, Camilla, and for getting us off to a very good start in this week's lectures.
Good.